I'd been sleeping in my car for 3 nights after leaving my son's house, unable to bear another day of my daughter-in-law's cold stares and whispered complaints. I clutched the brass key and a note in my late wife's handwriting that read, "Where colors became our language." The wooden door to the art studio I'd inherited from my wife creaked open under my shaking hands. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam as it swept across abandoned easels and paint-splattered drop cloths. But then the light caught something that made my blood freeze, a canvas turned toward the wall, still wet with fresh paint. My heart pounded as I approached, and what I discovered would change everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. My name is Henry Blake, and at 65 years old, I never thought I'd be homeless. 3 nights sleeping in my 2010 Honda Civic had left my back screaming and my pride in tatters. 3 nights since I'd finally walked away from the constant tension in David's house. I was unable to bear another moment of Jessica's cold stares and whispered complaints about how I was disrupting their healing process and not processing grief in a healthy way. I clutched the brass key and a note in my late wife's handwriting that read, "Where colors became our language." Margaret had left me this art studio in her will, but I'd avoided coming here for months. The pain of facing her empty workspace, the remnants of dreams that had outlived the dreamer, felt overwhelming. But now, it was all I had left. The wooden door to the art studio I'd inherited from my wife creaked open under my shaking hands, releasing the scent of dried paint and turpentine that had lingered for months since her funeral. I'd brought a flashlight from my car, knowing the old building's electricity had been turned off. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it, frozen in time, like a museum of our 42-year marriage. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam as it swept across abandoned easels and paint-splattered drop cloths. Her coffee cup still sat on the workbench, a ring of dried coffee staining the bottom. Her reading glasses lay folded beside a palette knife crusted with dried paint. Each detail was exactly as I remembered from my last visit here with Margaret, when she was still strong enough to paint, still believing she might beat the cancer. But then the light caught something that made my blood freeze, a canvas turned toward the wall, positioned near the window where Margaret always worked on her most important pieces. The back of the canvas showed fresh wood, unstained by age or neglect. This wasn't one of her older works. This was recent, maybe even new. My heart pounded as I approached, each step echoing in the silence. The floorboards creaked under my weight, the same protest they'd made for 30 years whenever I'd come to watch Margaret work. But Margaret was gone. Margaret had been gone for 4 months. So who had painted this canvas? And why was the paint still wet when I touched the edge with trembling fingers? I grabbed the canvas with both hands and turned it around. What I discovered would change everything. The painting showed our kitchen table from 30 years ago, complete with the coffee ring stains and the wobbly leg I'd never fixed. But what made my throat tighten wasn't the perfect detail. It was the 2 coffee cups, still steaming in the painted morning light. One sat in front of my usual chair, the other waited across the table, untouched, as if she'd just stepped away to get cream. At the bottom corner, in Margaret's unmistakable script, "Every morning I waited for you to come home to me." I reached out to touch the surface, my finger coming away with a streak of burnt sienna. Fresh. Someone had been here recently. Someone who knew exactly how our mornings used to look before everything fell apart. The studio felt smaller than I remembered, cluttered with memories I'd tried to forget. Margaret's easel stood in the corner where she'd left it, a half-finished landscape of the lake where we'd honeymooned still clipped to the wooden frame. Tubes of paint lay scattered across the workbench like discarded dreams, their labels faded but their contents still soft when I squeezed them. A manila folder sat beneath a paint-stained cloth near the window. My hands trembled as I lifted the fabric, revealing a collection of sketches I'd never seen before. The top drawing showed me sleeping in my recliner, my reading glasses crooked on my nose, a book forgotten in my lap. The detail was extraordinary, every wrinkle in my face, every gray hair, every tired line that spoke of 40 years working at the steel mill to keep our family afloat. But it wasn't just the accuracy that stopped my breath. It was the title written in Margaret's careful script at the bottom. My hero, resting. The date was from just 2 weeks before she died. I flipped through more sketches. Me fixing the kitchen sink. Me teaching our son David how to change a tire. Me bringing her soup when she was sick, long before the cancer came. Each drawing captured moments I'd forgotten, moments when I'd felt useful, needed, important. The man in these sketches wasn't the burden Jessica made me feel like. He was a father, a husband, a provider. At the bottom of the stack, I found something that made my hands shake. A letter, sealed in an envelope with my name written in Margaret's handwriting. But this wasn't from months ago. The ink was still dark, the paper crisp. Someone had placed it here recently. I tore open the envelope with fingers that wouldn't cooperate. Inside, Margaret's familiar handwriting filled a single page. My dearest Henry, if you're reading this, then the truth is finally coming to light. I've hidden things from you, terrible things that Jessica made me promise to keep secret. But I can't take them to my grave. Look behind the landscape painting. The real story is there. You were never the problem, my love. You were always the solution. My heart hammered against my ribs as I moved to the easel. Behind the unfinished lake scene, tucked between the canvas and the backing board, I found a small recording device, one of those digital ones David had bought Margaret to record her thoughts during chemo. The display showed it contained over 2 hours of recordings, all dated from the final weeks of her life. I pressed play with a finger that shook like a leaf. Margaret's voice filled the studio, weak but clear. Day 1. Jessica came again today. She said if I tell Henry about the medical bills, about the insurance money, about what she's been doing with David's power of attorney, she'll make sure Henry never sees his grandchildren. She said I'm dying anyway, so what does it matter if I go quietly? The recording device slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the paint-stained floor. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my skin crawl, footsteps on the gravel outside. Someone was coming. The recording continued to play as I stood frozen in that dusty studio, but the footsteps outside made me scramble to pause it. I wasn't ready to face anyone yet. Not until I understood what Margaret had really been trying to tell me. Margaret's voice, getting weaker with each entry, revealed a nightmare I'd never suspected. Jessica hadn't been the devoted daughter-in-law I'd believed her to be. She'd been systematically isolating Margaret from me during those final weeks, controlling every aspect of her care, intercepting my phone calls, and feeding David lies about my behavior. Day 12, Margaret's voice whispered through the static. Henry tried to visit today, but Jessica told him I was sleeping. I wasn't sleeping. I was awake, waiting for him, like I wait every day. She says he's becoming forgetful, that his visits upset me. None of that is true. The only thing that upsets me is not seeing my husband's face. I grabbed the device from the floor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. The timestamp showed Margaret had been recording right up until 3 days before she died. 3 days when Jessica claimed I was too disruptive to visit. Day 18. Jessica brought papers today, insurance forms. She said they needed my signature to help Henry with his finances after I'm gone. I was so foggy from the medication I could barely read them. But I signed them because she said it would help him. Now I'm wondering if I made a terrible mistake. The footsteps outside had stopped, but I could hear muffled voices through the thin walls of the studio. David's voice, questioning. Jessica's voice, sharp with irritation. They'd come looking for the man who'd vanished in the middle of the night, leaving only a note saying he needed space to grieve properly. I fast-forwarded through the recordings, catching fragments that made my stomach turn. Margaret described how Jessica had convinced the hospital staff that I was becoming aggressive during visits. Margaret pleaded to see me just one more time before the end. Margaret was crying alone in her bed because she thought I'd abandoned her. My phone buzzed in my pocket. David's name appeared on the cracked screen, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. What would I say? That his wife had been lying to all of us? That she'd kept me from saying goodbye to my own wife? That Margaret had died believing I'd abandoned her? Instead of answering, I scrolled through my recent calls. 17 missed calls to David over the past 3 days. 17 times I'd tried to explain why I couldn't keep living in that house, listening to Jessica's subtle insults, watching her roll her eyes every time I spoke. He'd called me paranoid, said I was imagining things, said I needed to adjust to being a widower. The studio's landline phone, covered in dust and paint splatters, sat silent on Margaret's workbench. I lifted the receiver and dialed David's number, my fingers stabbing each digit like an accusation. "Dad?" His voice sounded surprised. "Where are you? We've been looking everywhere for you. You just disappeared without saying anything." "I left a note on the kitchen table," I said quietly. "I told you I was going to find somewhere else to stay so Jessica could have the peace she wanted." "What?" "Dad, that's not Jessica's been worried sick. We both have. You can't just leave in the middle of the night like that." "Like what, David?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Like someone who's tired of being treated like an inconvenience in his own family?" "That's not fair. You know we care about you, but Jessica thinks I'm a problem." I stared at the recording device in my palm. "Tell me something, son." "During those last few weeks, when I couldn't see your mother, when Jessica said she was too weak for visitors, did you ever think that was strange?" Silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside, I could hear Jessica's voice getting louder, more demanding. She was directing David around the property, searching for me like I was a lost pet. Finally, David sighed. "Mom was dying, Dad." Jessica was trying to protect her, to make her comfortable. You were having a hard time accepting that. I was having a hard time accepting that my wife of 42 years was dying and I wasn't allowed to hold her hand. You were allowed. I was allowed when Jessica decided I was allowed. The recording device felt like a weapon in my palm. "David, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm at your mother's studio. I've found some things that are going to change how you see everything that happened." Another pause. I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, sharp and questioning. David's voice became muffled as he covered the phone, but I caught fragments. Acting strange? Paranoid? Probably having some kind of episode. "Dad?" David's voice returned, carefully controlled. "Jessica thinks maybe you should see someone. A counselor, someone who can help you work through the grief." Jessica thinks a lot of things. I looked around the studio, at Margaret's paintings, at the evidence of a lifetime of love that Jessica had tried to steal from me. But what Jessica thinks and what's true are two very different things. What's that supposed to mean? Through the window I could see them now. David in his work clothes, looking tired and worried. Jessica beside him in her designer coat, pointing toward the studio with perfectly manicured nails. She'd spotted my car parked behind the building. I could have told him everything right then, could have played Margaret's recordings over the phone, could have shattered his world with the truth about his wife. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Margaret's gentle wisdom, her belief that truth revealed too quickly could destroy rather than heal. "It means I'm not coming back to that house, David. Not while she's controlling what I can say, where I can go, who I can see. I raised you to be a good man, but somewhere along the way, you forgot that being a good husband doesn't mean being a blind one." "Dad, you're not making sense." "Come home. We'll figure this out." I am home. I looked around the studio, at the place where Margaret had poured her heart onto canvas for 30 years. For the first time in months, I'm actually home. I hung up before he could respond. The phone immediately started ringing again, but I ignored it. Instead, I pressed play on the recording device and let Margaret's voice wash over me like a benediction. Day 22. I tried to tell Jessica today that I wanted to see Henry alone just for an hour. She said that wouldn't be good for either of us. She said Henry was starting to decline and that seeing me this sick would only make it worse. But I know my husband. Henry Blake has never declined from anything in his life. He's the strongest man I know." The studio door rattled as someone tried the handle. Jessica's voice cut through the wood. "Henry Blake, we know you're in there. Stop acting like a child and come out." I looked at the fresh painting of our kitchen table, at the coffee cups that would never cool, at the message Margaret had somehow left for me from beyond the grave. Then I walked to the door and turned the lock. David stood in the doorway, looking like the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, uncertainty written across his face. Behind him, Jessica waited with arms crossed, her designer coat pristine despite the dusty gravel driveway. "Dad." David's voice held relief and frustration in equal measure. "We've been worried sick. You can't just disappear like that." "I didn't disappear," I said, stepping back to let them in. "I came to find the truth." "Truth?" Jessica's voice cut through the studio like broken glass. "What truth, Henry? That you've been hiding out here like some kind of hermit while your family worries about you?" "This isn't hiding," I said quietly, not moving from where I stood beside Margaret's easel. "This is remembering." David looked between us like he was watching a tennis match, confusion clouding his features. "Dad, what's going on? You've been acting strange ever since Mom died, but this running away, sleeping in your car, this isn't like you." "No," I agreed, "it's not like me." The man you think you know would have accepted Jessica's version of events, would have believed that his dying wife didn't want to see him, would have gone quietly into whatever corner your wife decided was appropriate for discarded family members. Jessica's face flushed red. "That's not fair, Henry. I've done everything I could to help this family through a difficult time. If you can't appreciate that—" "Appreciate it?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jessica, sit down, both of you, because there are some things about your mother's final weeks that you need to understand." I moved to Margaret's chair, the one she'd painted in so many self-portraits over the years. The studio surrounded us with 45 years of documented love paintings of our first apartment, sketches of David as a baby, landscapes from family vacations I'd worked double shifts to afford. "I met your mother 45 years ago," I began, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. She was 22, fresh out of college with paint under her fingernails and dreams bigger than our small Indiana town could hold. I was 23, working double shifts at the steel mill, my hands permanently stained with grease and my back already aching from years of heavy lifting. David settled onto a paint-stained stool, his expression softening. He'd heard parts of this story before, but never like this. Never with the weight of recent betrayal coloring every word. "She shouldn't have looked twice at me," I continued, "but she did. You have an artist's hands," she said that first day, studying my palm like she could read my future there. "Strong, but gentle. Hands that create things instead of just destroying them." I held up my hands, weathered now by decades of honest work. I laughed, showing her the calluses and scars from years of industrial work. "These hands haven't created anything beautiful in their whole life." And you know what she said? David shook his head, drawn into the story despite himself. She said, "They will. They'll create a family, a home, a life worth living." Jessica shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, checking her watch like she had somewhere more important to be. But David was listening, really listening, for the first time in months. "We bought this studio with our wedding money, a converted garage behind old Mrs. Patterson's house. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Your mother would paint here every evening after her job at the elementary school, and I'd join her on weekends, reading in the corner while she worked. She never asked me to pose, but somehow I always ended up in her paintings anyway." I gestured to the walls around us, covered with Margaret's work. Background figure. Supporting character. The man who kept the world running while she made it beautiful. "Dad," David said softly, "I remember coming here when I was little. Mom would set up a small easel for me next to hers. Every Saturday morning for 10 years, I confirmed. You'd paint dinosaurs and spaceships while she worked on her landscapes. She kept every single one of your paintings, you know. They're in a box in the back closet, right next to mine. Yours? David looked surprised. She convinced me to try a few times over the years. I was terrible at it, but she never laughed. She'd hang my crooked attempts right next to her masterpieces and tell everyone who visited that her husband was developing his artistic voice. I stood and walked to a cabinet I'd discovered earlier, pulling out a small canvas I'd painted for Margaret's 50th birthday. It showed our kitchen table, the same scene she'd recreated in that mysterious, fresh painting, but rendered with the clumsy enthusiasm of someone who loved the subject more than he understood the technique. She hung this in our bedroom for 15 years, I said, showing them the painting, even though it looked like something a child might do in art class. Jessica made a sound of impatience. Henry, this is all very touching, but what does any of this have to do with your bizarre behavior lately? It has everything to do with it, I said, setting the painting aside. Because this studio, this place you once called a charming little art space when you first met us, this was where your mother and I were happiest, where we planned our future, raised our son, dreamed our dreams, and it's where she came to hide when she realized our family was being poisoned from the inside. What's that supposed to mean? Jessica's voice had developed an edge that David seemed to notice for the first time. It means your mother knew you didn't like her, Jessica. Knew you thought she was too involved in David's life, too opinionated about your choices, too attached to traditions you found inconvenient, but we tried so hard to welcome you into our family. I moved to a framed photograph on Margaret's workbench. Jessica's wedding day, where Margaret and I stood beaming beside the happy couple. Do you remember what your mother did when you and David got engaged, son? David's expression softened. She gave Jessica her grandmother's ring, the one you'd bought her for your 25th anniversary. Because Jessica admired it, I continued, looking directly at her. Your mother took off her most precious piece of jewelry and gave it to you, saying every Blake woman should have something beautiful to pass down. You wore it for exactly 3 months before deciding it was too old-fashioned for your taste. Jessica's face flushed, but she remained silent. And when you needed help with the down payment for your first house, I continued, who took out a second mortgage on this place to loan you $40,000? Money we're still paying back, by the way, even though you've never mentioned paying us back. Dad, David started. Let me finish, son. When Jessica wanted to go back to school for her MBA, who took on extra housekeeping jobs for the Hendersons and the Millers every weekend for 6 months to help pay for her tuition? Your mother, even though her arthritis was already making it hard for her to manage the physical work. I walked to Margaret's desk, pulling out a folder I'd discovered earlier. And when Jessica's parents refused to help with the wedding because they didn't approve of David's blue-collar family, who spent their entire retirement savings to give you the wedding of your dreams, we ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights a week for 2 years to pay for that reception. David started to protest, but I held up a hand. Let me finish, son, because this is important. Because every act of kindness your mother showed Jessica, every sacrifice we made to help you build your life together, was thrown back in our faces the moment Jessica decided we were inconvenient. I pulled out a small notebook from the folder. Margaret's careful handwriting documenting every loan, every favor, every kindness. Your mother kept track, not to hold it over anyone's head, but because she wanted to make sure we could help when you needed us. She documented 5 years of trying to love someone who saw our generosity as weakness. I moved to Margaret's easel, where that unfinished landscape still sat clipped to the wooden frame. When your mother got sick, I thought Jessica was being helpful. Organizing the medical appointments, managing the paperwork, making sure Margaret got the care she needed. I was grateful. My voice cracked slightly. I was so grateful that someone was taking care of the details while I tried to take care of my wife's heart. You were taking care of her heart, David said firmly. Mom loved you more than anything. Did she? I turned to face them both. Because in those final weeks, your wife convinced your mother that I was becoming a burden, that my visits were too emotional, too disruptive, that for Margaret's own good, I should stay away. Jessica's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. That's not how it happened, Henry. You're twisting everything. Yes, you helped us get started, but that's what parents are supposed to do. You were having a hard time seeing Margaret so sick. The doctors said, "Which doctors?" I challenged myself, because I was never present for any conversations with doctors. I was never consulted about any medical decisions. I was shut out of my own wife's care by someone who convinced everyone she was acting in Margaret's best interests. I pulled out the folder of sketches I'd found earlier, opening it to the drawing titled, "My Hero Resting." Your mother drew this 2 weeks before she died, David. Look at the date. Look at the title. Does this look like the work of someone who thought her husband was a burden? David took the sketch with trembling hands, studying every line Margaret had carefully drawn. She drew you while you were sleeping? She drew me every chance she got, apparently, because while Jessica was telling me that my visits were too upsetting, your mother was here in this studio, documenting every moment of love she could remember. I showed them more sketches, me fixing the sink, teaching David to drive, bringing Margaret soup during her chemotherapy treatments. Each drawing was dated from those final weeks, each one showing a woman desperate to hold on to the love she was being forced to push away. But why would Jessica? David started, then stopped, looking at his wife with new eyes. Why would Jessica want to separate us? I finished. That's an excellent question, son. And fortunately, your mother left us the answer. I pulled out the recording device, holding it where they both could see it. Jessica's face went from pale to gray. "What is that?" David asked. "That," I said, "is your mother's voice. Telling the truth about what really happened in those final weeks. Telling the truth about why she died believing her husband had abandoned her." Jessica stood up abruptly. "David, we don't have to listen to this. Your father is clearly having some kind of breakdown." "Sit down, Jessica," David said, his voice containing an authority I hadn't heard in years. "I want to hear what my mother had to say." I pressed play, and Margaret's weak but determined voice filled the studio once again. Day 15. Jessica came by again today with more papers. She says they're just routine forms, but I'm starting to wonder if she's having me sign away more than I understand. When I asked to have Henry look them over, she said that would just confuse things, that Henry doesn't understand financial matters the way she does. But Henry worked 40 years to build our security. He understands money better than anyone. David's face crumpled. "Mom wanted you to look at the papers." According to this, she wanted me involved in every decision. But I was never given that chance. I fast-forwarded to another entry. Day 20. I told Jessica today that I wanted to change my will back to the original version, the one that leaves everything to Henry with David inheriting when his father passes. She said that wasn't fair to David, that he needs security now with the baby coming. What baby? When I asked her what she meant, she said she'd spoken out of turn, that it was supposed to be a surprise. David stood up so suddenly that his stool toppled over. She knew about the pregnancy? Before Mom died? Apparently, your wife had been planning your future for quite some time, I said quietly, using your mother's illness as an opportunity to rearrange our family according to her preferences. I played one more entry. Day 23. I'm so weak now, but I need to record this. Jessica brought divorce papers today. She said if I didn't convince Henry to sign them, if I didn't push him away permanently, she'd make sure he never got to meet his grandchildren. She said a man his age doesn't have long anyway, so what difference would it make? I told her I would never betray my husband like that. She said then she'd make sure David never knew the truth about the baby, never knew how much I wanted to see his children grow up. The recording ended in silence, so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. David stood frozen, staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. "Jessica," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Is that true?" Jessica looked between us, trapped and desperate. David, you have to understand. I was trying to protect our future, our family. Your father was going to inherit everything, and we have a baby to think about. You used my dying mother to steal from my father? David's voice rose with each word. You manipulated her into believing she had to choose between her husband and her grandchildren? I was thinking about what was best for everyone. You were thinking about what was best for yourself, I said calmly. And you nearly destroyed our family to get it. David sat back down heavily, his head in his hands. Mom died thinking... He couldn't finish the sentence. Your mother died thinking I'd abandoned her, I completed gently, thinking that after 42 years of marriage, I'd decided she wasn't worth fighting for. I knelt beside his chair, but she also died knowing it wasn't true. She made these recordings because she knew someone would find them eventually. She left me this studio because she knew I'd come here looking for answers. Your mother understood Jessica better than any of us, and she made sure the truth would survive. When David finally looked up, his eyes were red but clear. Jessica, he said, I think you should leave. David, please. Leave, now. I need to talk to my father. After Jessica left, the studio felt different. Lighter, somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the very walls. David and I sat among Margaret's paintings, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had survived even death. Dad, David said finally, I'm so sorry. I should have seen what she was doing. She's good at what she does, son. Manipulation takes skill, and she's had years to perfect it. But I should have protected Mom. Should have protected you. I pulled him into a hug, feeling his shoulders shake with grief and rage. You were protecting your family the way you thought was right. That's what good men do. What happens now? I looked around the studio, at the place where Margaret had poured her heart onto canvas for 30 years, at the fresh painting that had started this whole revelation, still sitting where I'd found it, still wet with impossible paint. Now, I said, we figure out who's been continuing your mother's work. David stood in the doorway, looking like the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, uncertainty written across his face. But now, with Jessica gone, I could see the man I'd raised him to be starting to emerge from under years of manipulation. Dad, he said, settling back onto the stool, there's something I need to tell you. About Mom's final days, I braced myself for more revelations, more pain that I'd somehow missed. I knew something was wrong, David continued, his voice thick with guilt. Jessica would tell me Mom was sleeping when I called, or that she'd had a bad reaction to medication and couldn't see visitors. But when I did get to see her, Mom would ask about you constantly. Where's your father? Why hasn't he been here? Does he know I've been asking for him? My throat tightened. What did you tell her? I told her you'd been there, that Jessica was coordinating your visits to make sure Mom got enough rest. I thought I was protecting everyone. He laughed bitterly. I was so stupid. You weren't stupid, son. You were being lied to by someone you trusted. But I should have questioned it more, should have insisted on talking to the doctors myself, should have made sure you were included in everything. David picked up one of Margaret's paintbrushes, turning it over in his hands. The last time I saw her, Mom grabbed my hand and said, "Promise me you'll take care of your father. Promise me you won't let anyone convince you he doesn't matter." The words hit me like a physical blow. She said that? I thought she was just worried about you being alone after she was gone. I didn't realize she was trying to warn me. David set down the brush and looked directly at me. I failed her, Dad. I failed both of you. No, I said firmly. Jessica failed us. You were just trying to hold your family together during an impossible time. I walked to the window where Margaret used to stand while painting, looking out at the same view she'd captured in dozens of landscapes. Your mother understood that good people can be manipulated, David. That's why she left evidence. She knew you'd figure it out eventually. The evidence, David said suddenly. Dad, we need to take this to the police. What Jessica did, isolating Mom, manipulating her into changing legal documents while she was on heavy medication. That's got to be some kind of crime. I turned back to him, considering. Elder abuse, at minimum. Possibly fraud, depending on what she had your mother sign. And we have proof. Mom's recordings, the sketches, everything. For the first time in months, I felt something like hope stirring in my chest. Not for revenge exactly, but for justice. For the truth to be acknowledged, for Margaret's suffering to be validated. There's more, I said, moving to another cabinet I'd been exploring. Your mother was thorough. I pulled out a manila envelope labeled "For Henry's Eyes Only" in Margaret's careful script. Inside were photocopies of documents, insurance forms, will changes, power of attorney papers, all signed in Margaret's increasingly shaky handwriting as her illness progressed. Look at the dates, I said, spreading the papers on Margaret's workbench. Every single change Jessica requested happened on days when I was told your mother was too sick for visitors. David studied the documents, his jaw tightening with each page. She isolated Mom specifically on the days she needed to sign things. And look at this. I pointed to a series of bank statements Margaret had somehow obtained. 3 large withdrawals from your mother's account in the final month, all made by Jessica using the power of attorney. Where did the money go? According to these records, Jessica opened an account for David's future children. Money that was supposed to help with my care after your mother died. David's face had gone pale. She stole from Mom's medical fund? She stole from our entire life savings, son. Used your mother's love for you and her grandchildren as leverage to convince her to sign away everything we'd built together. I showed him one final document, a life insurance policy Margaret had apparently signed shortly before her death, naming Jessica as the primary beneficiary instead of me. $1.5 million, David read aloud. Dad, did you know about this policy? I knew about the policy, but for much less money, and I was supposed to be the beneficiary. I sat down heavily in Margaret's chair. Jessica convinced your mother that I was too old and confused to handle that kind of money responsibly. David stood up abruptly, pacing the small studio like a caged animal. She used Mom's cancer as an opportunity to rob our family blind. She used your mother's cancer as an opportunity to eliminate me from your lives permanently, I corrected. The money was just a bonus. We're going to the police. Today, right now. I looked around the studio, at the paintings Margaret had created over 30 years, at the sketches she'd hidden away like love letters to a future she wouldn't live to see. Your mother wouldn't want us to act out of anger, David. This isn't anger, Dad. This is justice. Justice for your mother, yes. But what about justice for your unborn child? Jessica is carrying your baby, son. Whatever happens to her happens to your child, too. David stopped pacing, the weight of that reality settling on his shoulders. I can't stay married to someone who would do this to my family. No, I agreed. You can't. But you can make sure your child grows up knowing the truth about their grandmother, knowing that Margaret Blake was a woman who loved so deeply she documented her own suffering to protect the people she cared about. I picked up the recording device, holding it like the precious thing it was. This isn't just evidence of Jessica's crimes, David. It's proof of your mother's love. Proof that even when she was dying, even when she was being manipulated and isolated, she never stopped fighting for our family. David sat back down, his head in his hands. What do I do, Dad? How do I handle this? We handle it together, I said simply. The way we should have been handling everything all along. I moved to Margaret's easel, looking at that unfinished landscape of the lake where we'd honeymooned. Your mother never got to finish this painting, but she gave us everything we needed to finish the story. We take the evidence to the authorities. We make sure Jessica faces consequences for what she did, and we make sure your child grows up in a family built on truth instead of manipulation. And then? I smiled. The first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Then we learned to be a family again. We honor your mother's memory by being the kind of people she raised us to be. And we make sure that the studio, this place where colors became our language, continues to be a place where love is documented and preserved." David looked around the studio with new eyes. "She really did leave us everything we needed, didn't she? Your mother was an artist, son. She understood that the most important things in life are the ones you can't see unless someone teaches you how to look." I gestured to the fresh painting that had started this whole journey. Someone's been coming here, continuing her work, painting our story even after she's gone. That's not about money or wills or legal documents. That's about love refusing to die. Who do you think it is? I have my suspicions. But whoever it is, they understand what this place means, what your mother meant to us. I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in months. "Are you ready to fight for her memory, David?" "I'm ready, Dad." "Then let's go make sure your mother's voice is heard." The police station felt colder than the studio, all fluorescent lights and institutional beige that made everything seem harsh and unforgiving. Detective Martinez, a woman about David's age with kind eyes and calloused hands, listened to Margaret's recordings with the focused attention of someone who'd heard too many stories about families torn apart by greed. "This is compelling evidence," she said after we'd played the key recordings. "Elder abuse, financial exploitation, possible coercion in legal matters. How long ago did your wife pass, Mr. Blake?" 4 months, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. 4 months of me thinking I'd failed her somehow. Detective Martinez spread out copies of the documents we'd brought, the insurance papers, the will changes, the bank statements showing Jessica's unauthorized withdrawals. "Did your wife have any physical evidence of her interactions with Mrs. Blake? Text messages, emails, anything that might corroborate these recordings?" David pulled out his phone. "I never thought to check Mom's phone after she died. Jessica said she'd take care of clearing out the personal stuff." Jessica took Mom's phone, I realized. Said it would be too painful for us to go through her messages. "We'll want to subpoena those phone records." Detective Martinez made a note. "And we'll need to examine the original will to determine if there are signs of coercion or diminished capacity when the changes were made." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of statements and paperwork. David and I sat side by side, finally working together toward the same goal, finally fighting for the same thing. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt like I had my son back. "There's one more thing," Detective Martinez said as we prepared to leave. "The life insurance policy your daughter-in-law claimed, that's a significant amount of money. If we can prove she obtained it through fraudulent means, she'll likely face felony charges." "What does that mean for the baby?" David asked quietly. "That depends on a lot of factors we can't control," the detective said gently. "But I will say this. Children are generally better off with parents who tell the truth, even when the truth is complicated." When we walked out of the police station, the sun was setting over the small Indiana town where I'd lived my entire life. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying the weight of unanswered questions. "Dad," David said as we reached our cars, "I need to go home and talk to Jessica. Tell her what's happening. Are you sure you want to do that alone?" David nodded. "She's still my wife. Still carrying my child. I owe her the chance to explain herself before the police show up at our door." I understood. Even after everything Jessica had done, David was still the good man I'd raised him to be, still believing in the possibility of redemption, still hoping for the best in people, even when they'd shown him their worst. "Call me if you need anything," I said. "Anything at all." "Where will you go? You're not sleeping in your car again." I smiled. "I think it's time I went home. Real home. To the studio." That night, I made up a bed on the old couch Margaret had kept in the studio for the time she worked late into the evening. It wasn't comfortable, but it was mine. Surrounded by her paintings, by the evidence of our life together, I felt more at peace than I had since the day she died. I was nearly asleep when my phone rang. David's name on the screen, calling at nearly midnight. "Dad?" His voice was shaky, exhausted. "What happened?" She confessed. When I confronted her with the recordings, she broke down and confessed to everything. The manipulation, the isolation, the money, all of it. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. How is she handling it? "She keeps saying she was trying to protect our future, that you were going to waste Mom's legacy on medical bills and old age care. She really believed she was doing the right thing. People can convince themselves of anything when they want something badly enough," I said. "What happens now?" "She's agreed to cooperate with the police, to return the money she took from Mom's accounts. She says she wants to make things right." "And the baby?" David was quiet for a long moment. I told her, I can't stay married to someone who would torture my dying mother for money. But I also told her that her child will always be my child, and my child will always be your grandchild. "That's the right thing, son." "I'm scared, Dad. About being a single father, about raising a child whose mother is going to be facing criminal charges, about explaining to my kid someday why Mommy hurt Grandma Margaret." "You won't be raising that child alone," I said firmly. "And when the time comes to explain the difficult things, we'll do it together. We'll make sure your child knows they come from a family that values truth even when truth is hard." 2 weeks later, Jessica was arrested at the small apartment she'd moved to after David filed for divorce. The charges were extensive elder abuse, fraud, theft, coercion of legal documents. The local newspaper ran a story about it, calling it a tragic case of financial exploitation of a dying woman. But they didn't understand the real tragedy. The real tragedy wasn't the money. It was the months of Margaret dying alone, believing her husband had abandoned her. Jessica's arrest made the studio feel even more like a sanctuary. David came by every day after work, and we'd spend hours going through Margaret's paintings, organizing them chronologically, creating a visual timeline of our family's history. We found paintings from our early marriage I'd forgotten about, sketches of David as a toddler that captured expressions I remembered perfectly, landscapes of places we'd visited on family vacations 30 years ago. "Look at this," David said one evening, holding up a small canvas I'd never seen before. It showed the three of us, in this very studio David, about 10 years old, painting at a small easel while Margaret and I watched from across the room. But what made me catch my breath was the title Margaret had written at the bottom, "The Next Generation." "She always believed you'd come back to painting someday," I said. "Maybe I will. Maybe that's something I can do with my own child. Your mother would like that." We worked in comfortable silence for a while, organizing and cataloging, preserving Margaret's legacy in a way that honored her memory. The mysterious fresh painting still hung where I'd found it, that impossible scene of our kitchen table with its eternal coffee cups. We'd never solved that mystery completely, but somehow it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we were here, together, continuing the work Margaret had started. "Dad," David said suddenly, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What's that?" "When the baby comes, would you consider moving back into a house?" "Not my old house with Jessica, that's over, but maybe we could find a place together. You and me and the baby." I looked around the studio at the place that had become my refuge, my connection to Margaret. "What about this place?" "We keep it. We make it part of our family's story. But Dad, I don't want my child growing up thinking their grandfather lives alone in a garage. I want them to know you're part of our daily life, part of our family." The offer touched something deep inside me, something that had been wounded by months of isolation and manipulation. "Are you sure, son? Raising a baby is hard work. An old man underfoot might not be helpful. An old man with an artist's hands who knows how to love without conditions?" David smiled. "That sounds like exactly what my child is going to need." I thought about Margaret's note, where colors became our language, and realized she'd been preparing us for this moment all along. She'd documented our love not just as a record of the past, but as a foundation for the future. "I'd be honored," I said. That night I called Mrs. Patterson to tell her about our plans. She listened with the kind of patience that comes from 8 decades of watching families fall apart and come back together. "Your Margaret would be so proud," she said when I finished. "She always said you and David were her greatest works of art." "Mrs. Patterson," I said, "I have to ask you something. That fresh painting I found in the studio, the one of our kitchen tables, do you know anything about that?" She was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, softly, "Your wife asked me to check on the studio after she was gone, to make sure it was being cared for. I may have taken some liberties with that request." "You painted it?" "I painted what I remembered from the stories Margaret told me. About your morning coffee, about the way you'd wait for each other, about the kind of love that doesn't end just because someone dies." I felt tears gathering in my eyes. "Thank you. Thank you for sharing her with us, Henry. Margaret's story isn't over. It's just moved into a new chapter." After I hung up, I sat in the studio surrounded by 30 years of Margaret's work, thinking about chapters and continuations, about the difference between endings and transitions. Jessica had tried to write us out of our own story, but she'd failed. Love, it turned out, was more persistent than manipulation. Truth was stronger than lies, and family, real family, could survive almost anything. Tomorrow, David and I will start looking for a house big enough for 3 generations. We'd create new traditions, new routines, new ways of being together. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the place where colors had always been our language, where Margaret's voice still echoed in every brushstroke, where the next chapter of our story was waiting to be painted. 3 months later, I was standing in that same studio, but everything had changed. The windows had been cleaned, letting natural light stream across freshly organized supplies. Margaret's paintings hung properly framed on the walls, no longer gathering dust, but displayed with the respect they deserved. And in the center of the room, David sat at a new easel, working on a painting of his own, while his 3-month-old daughter slept in a carrier beside him. "I never knew she had so many paintings of you," he said, adding a careful stroke of blue to the sky he was creating. "You're in almost every piece she ever did." "Background figure," I said, settling into the chair I'd brought from home. She always said I was the constant that let her create. "You weren't background, Dad. You were the foundation." Little Margaret, named for her grandmother, as David had promised, stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that had become the new soundtrack of our lives. She had David's nose, but Margaret's delicate fingers, already reaching for colors and textures with an intensity that reminded me of her grandmother. I watched my son work, seeing Margaret's careful technique in the way he held the brush, her patient observation in how he studied each color before applying it. The studio had become our meeting place, neutral ground where we could rebuild what Jessica had tried to destroy. The legal proceedings had been swift once Margaret's evidence came to light. The will signed under Jessica's influence was declared invalid, reverting to Margaret's original documents. But more importantly, the recordings and photographs had provided enough evidence for the district attorney to file charges of elder abuse and fraud. Jessica's threats to keep me from my grandchildren had become legally meaningless the moment a judge heard Margaret's voice describing the coercion. "The restraining order got extended again," David said, as if reading my thoughts. "Jessica's not allowed within 500 feet of any of us for another year." "That's hard for you," I said. It wasn't a question. "Harder than losing Mom, in some ways." He paused in his painting, brush hovering over the canvas. "At least with Mom, I knew the love was real. With Jessica, I keep wondering how much of our entire relationship was just calculation." "The baby is real," I reminded him, looking at my granddaughter's peaceful face. "Whatever else Jessica is, she gave us Margaret." David nodded, returning to his work. The painting was taking shape, a landscape of the lake where Margaret and I had honeymooned, but seen through his eyes instead of hers. Different perspective, same foundation of love. "I've been thinking about that fresh painting," David said suddenly. "The one you found that first night. the one that started all this. I looked across the studio to where it still hung, that impossible painting of our kitchen table with its steaming coffee cups. We'd solved the mystery months ago when Mrs. Patterson confessed to continuing Margaret's work, but the painting itself remained as powerful as ever. What about it? I think I understand now why Mrs. Patterson painted it. Oh! David set down his brush and walked to the painting, studying it with the kind of attention Margaret had taught him to bring to art. It's not really about the coffee cups, is it? It's about waiting, about the faith that someone you love will come back to the table. I joined him in front of the painting, seeing it with fresh eyes. Your mother always said I was worth waiting for. And you were. Even when Jessica tried to convince everyone otherwise, even when I was too blind to see what was happening, you were still worth waiting for. Baby Margaret chose that moment to wake with a soft cry, and David moved to lift her from the carrier. She settled immediately against his chest, tiny fingers grasping at his shirt as if anchoring herself to this new world of safety and love. She's going to grow up knowing her grandfather, David said, pressing his lips to the baby's soft hair. Jessica can't take that away from us anymore. She's going to grow up knowing her grandmother too, I added, gesturing to the painting surrounding us. Every story, every moment of love, every sacrifice that brought us to this point. The house David and I had bought together was only 10 minutes away, but we still spent most afternoons in the studio. It had become our family headquarters, the place where we planned baby Margaret's future and remembered adult Margaret's past, the place where 3 generations of love converged in the scent of paint and possibility. Mrs. Patterson called this morning, David said, settling back at his easel with the baby secure in one arm. She wants to donate some of her own paintings to the community center. Says she's been inspired by Mom's example to share her work instead of hiding it. That's beautiful. She also asked if we'd help her organize an art show. Local artists share their stories through their work. She wants to call it Where Colors Become Language. The words hit me like a gentle wave of recognition. Margaret's phrase, taking on new life in the hands of people who understood its meaning. Art as communication, love as creation, memory as resistance against those who would try to erase it. Your mother would love that, I said. I was thinking of contributing something myself, David said, nodding toward his work in progress. Nothing fancy, just my version of Mom's Lake. A way of continuing the conversation she started. I looked at his painting still rough, still learning, but already showing signs of the patient observation Margaret had valued above technical skill. She'd be proud of you, son. I hope so. I have a lot of makeup to do. You don't have anything to make up for. You have everything to look forward to. Baby Margaret had fallen back asleep against her father's chest, one tiny hand curled around his thumb with the absolute trust that only comes from love proven consistent. I thought about the cycles of care and protection, about how Margaret had once held David the same way, about how he would teach his daughter to hold on to the people who mattered. Dad, David said softly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found Mom's recordings? If Jessica had succeeded in driving us apart permanently? I considered the question seriously. I think your mother would have found another way. She was an artist, David. She understood that the most important messages always find their way to the people who need to hear them. Even from beyond the grave? Especially from beyond the grave. I gestured to the studio around us, to the 30 years of documented love hanging on the walls. This place is proof that some conversations don't end just because one person stops talking. They just require different kinds of listening. As evening settled over the studio, David packed up his paints and I tidied Margaret's supplies. This had become our routine, spending afternoons here together, working on separate projects but sharing the same space, the same sense of purpose. Baby Margaret slept through it all, already accustomed to the rhythm of creativity and care that would define her childhood. Same time tomorrow? David asked, like he had every day for the past 3 months. Wouldn't miss it, I replied, like I had every day for the past 3 months. After they left, I sat alone in the studio, surrounded by Margaret's paintings, Mrs. Patterson's additions, and the lingering scent of fresh paint and possibility. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was full of potential, of work still to be done, of stories yet to be told. I picked up Margaret's unfinished landscape, the one that had been on her easel when she died. With careful strokes, I began to add details she'd never had the chance to complete. A small figure by the lake's edge, fishing from a weathered dock. Me, waiting patiently for something worth catching. But this time, I wasn't alone on that painted shore. A woman sat beside me, her hair silver in the painted sunlight, her hand resting on my arm. And just behind us, barely visible among the trees, two smaller figures played a man teaching a child to skip stones, the cycle of love continuing into another generation. Margaret always said colors were our language. Tonight, finally, I was learning to speak fluently. The conversation included not just the living, but the dead, not just the past, but the future, not just the pain, but the hope that grew from surviving it. I added one final detail to the painting, a small sailboat on the distant water, its white sail catching the wind, moving forward, but never forgetting where it had been. The mystery of the fresh painting that had started this journey remained solved in the conventional sense, Mrs. Patterson's loving tribute to a friend's marriage. But in the deeper sense that mattered, I understood perfectly. Love doesn't end with death. It transforms, finding new hands to continue the work, new voices to tell the story, new generations to carry the truth forward. Jessica was serving 18 months in minimum security prison, with mandatory counseling and community service focusing on elder care advocacy. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. But justice, real justice, wasn't about punishment. It was about making sure the truth was known, the vulnerable were protected, and the cycle of harm was broken. Mrs. Patterson's key to the studio lay on my workbench, returned with a note that simply read, "Thank you for letting an old woman remember how to create again." The paintings were never about art, they were about love refusing to be forgotten. I smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. Margaret's final gift hadn't been the studio itself, or even the evidence that cleared my name. It has been the reminder that creativity is just another word for hope, and hope is something that can survive any betrayal, any loss, any attempt to destroy it. The coffee cups in that mysterious first painting would never grow cold, because somewhere in the space between memory and faith, Margaret and I were still having our morning conversation. Still planning our day, still believing in tomorrow, still choosing each other over and over again across the impossible distance between life and death. Tomorrow, David and I will continue work on the nursery in our new house. We'd chosen yellow walls and white furniture, with one of Margaret's smaller landscapes hanging where baby Margaret could see it from her crib. We were creating new traditions, new routines, new ways of being family. But the studio would always be here, the place where colors first became our language, where Margaret's voice still echoed in every brushstroke, where the next chapter of our story was always waiting to be painted. I pulled out a fresh canvas and began to sketch. Not the past this time, but the future. 3 figures in a sunny kitchen, the older man teaching a younger one how to hold a baby while breakfast cooked on the stove. Love in ordinary moments, hope in daily routines. The kind of scene Margaret would have painted if she'd lived to see it. But she had seen it in the only way that mattered. She'd seen it in her faith that love persists, that family endures, that truth has a way of rising to the surface, even when it's been buried under months of lies. If you enjoyed this story about truth, justice, and the bonds that really matter, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts about family, forgiveness, and finding your way home in the comments below. To hear another story about love that refuses to be forgotten, click the video on your screen. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most important victories are the quiet ones that happen in dusty studios, when broken families learn to paint themselves whole again.